The BBC built its reputation on control. Control over content, over talent, over what the British public was allowed to see and hear. And when a performer threatened that control, whether they were a national treasure, a satirical genius, or a man who simply did a fertilizer commercial, the institution's response was always the same. What you're about to hear is not a collection of celebrity grievances. It is a documented pattern of institutional behavior spanning 5 decades of British broadcasting. These are 15 cases where the BBC, the most powerful media organization in British history, fired, banned, suppressed, or systematically marginalized performers and broadcasters. Stay to the end. The final case on this list is the one that reveals exactly how the BBC's internal logic actually worked, and it's not who you'd expect. If you're new here, subscribe now. This channel covers British entertainment history with documented facts and no mythology. Let's get into it. Number 1. Spike Milligan. One afternoon at BBC headquarters, Spike Milligan put his fist through a glass door. That moment wasn't really about the door. It was about 5 years of accumulated institutional resistance. As the driving creative force behind The Goon Show, Milligan had pushed British radio into territory it had never occupied. Strange, anarchic, structurally inventive, and entirely his own. He had open contempt for middle management. He argued over scripts. He resisted edits. He made it explicit that he did not regard the BBC's internal hierarchy as something he was required to respect. From the BBC side, this was not a personality problem. It was a control problem. They couldn't remove him. His work was too successful, too culturally significant. But they also couldn't maintain a functional institution where one person unilaterally dictated terms. So they didn't cancel him. They contained him. Budgets became harder to secure. Time slots became less favorable. Every decision required more approval, more negotiation, more resistance. Nothing was taken away in a single move. Everything just became heavier. His work stayed. His freedom didn't. Milligan wasn't pushed out for being unstable. He was managed down because he couldn't be managed at all. Number 2. Frank Bough. For years, Frank Bough was arguably the safest man on British television, the warm, dependable face of breakfast time and grandstand, the broadcaster in comfortable sweaters who projected absolute, unshakable respectability. He was precisely the kind of figure the BBC wanted the public to believe represented the institution itself. In 1988, the tabloid press dismantled that image overnight. Bough was exposed in a highly publicized scandal involving illegal substances and underground parties, behavior that stood in direct contrast to his wholesome, on-screen identity. The BBC sacked him immediately. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward moral clause violation. But if you examine the wider culture of British television during that era, a different reality emerges. Destructive behavior, vice, and excess were frequently tolerated by management, provided those activities stayed strictly behind closed doors. Bough's actual offense was not his private conduct. It was getting caught so publicly, so spectacularly, that he humiliated the network and shattered its carefully constructed brand. The BBC did not remove a disgraced presenter. They performed a highly visible institutional amputation to protect themselves. They did not fire him to uphold a consistent moral standard across the organization. They fired him because he could no longer be trusted to sell their fiction. Once an asset stops reflecting the image the system demands, their talent becomes irrelevant. They are simply discarded. Number 3. Kenny Everett. Kenny Everett did not use a microphone the way the BBC wanted him to. In the regulated corridors of Radio 1 during the late 1960s, presenters were expected to act as cheerful, obedient voices linking one record to the next. Everett treated the broadcast studio as his personal creative laboratory. He spliced tapes, layered chaotic sound effects, openly mocked station management on the air, and operated as a rogue element within a rigid bureaucracy. The network tolerated his eccentricities for one reason: the audience adored him. He was arguably the most innovative broadcaster of his generation, but his working style fundamentally clashed with the BBC's institutional culture. They wanted a popular employee. Everett wanted absolute creative autonomy. The breaking point came in 1970 when Everett made an unscripted, spontaneous joke about the wife of a government minister. By modern standards, the remark barely registers as offensive. But for BBC executives who had grown increasingly frustrated by his unpredictability, it was the perfect pretext. They fired him. When you examine the dismissal, it becomes clear that Everett was not removed to protect the moral fabric of the nation from a bad joke. He was removed to reestablish the chain of command. The joke was the tripwire. The actual offense was his persistent, cheerful refusal to fear his employers. By removing him, the BBC sent a message to every other broadcaster in the building: it doesn't matter how much of a genius you are or how many millions tune in. If the institution can no longer manage you, they will simply unplug you. Number 4. Dennis Potter. In 1976, the BBC completed an expensive, fully produced television film and then decided the public would not see it. It remained locked away for 11 years. The film was Brimstone and Treacle. The writer was Dennis Potter. By that point, Potter had already established himself as one of the most uncompromising voices in British television. His work didn't aim to reassure. It exposed things most people preferred not to examine. When executives saw the finished film, the official response was that it was nauseating and could not be broadcast. That explanation was clean. It wasn't complete. The real problem wasn't just the subject matter. It was the way Potter had handled it. There was no safe framing, no moral resolution that allowed the audience or the network to step back comfortably. The script didn't guide viewers toward a conclusion. It forced them to sit with the discomfort. And critically, it couldn't be softened. Potter didn't write scripts that could be adjusted into something safer. Structurally, they held together too tightly. Editorially, he refused to dilute them. The BBC had only two options: broadcast it as it was, or take public responsibility for something they hadn't fully controlled. They chose a third option instead. They waited 11 years. Number 5. Noël Coward. In 1943, Noël Coward released a satirical wartime song titled "Don't Let's Be Beastly" to the Germans. Winston Churchill reportedly found it hilarious. The BBC banned it outright. Coward was not a tabloid liability or a provocateur. He was the absolute pinnacle of British theatrical sophistication, a man who dined with royalty and possessed enormous cultural authority. Yet throughout his career, the BBC repeatedly found him threatening. His plays were flagged for being too sexually permissive. His broadcasts were restricted. His particular brand of wit was treated as a persistent broadcast hazard. The friction was not about standard misbehavior. It was a fundamental clash of languages. Coward operated entirely on irony, high camp, and layered double meanings. The BBC, particularly in its mid-century era, operated on institutional literalism. Their ban of the wartime song revealed a specific anxiety. They did not trust the general public to understand satire, and they did not trust an entertainer who refused to speak in the straightforward, earnest tone the network preferred. Coward presented a unique problem. He was too wealthy, too famous, and too well connected to be fired or intimidated like a regular presenter. So the BBC managed him the only way they could, by quietly policing his output and restricting his access to the national microphone whenever he became too subversive. His story confirms a specific truth about how the broadcasting system functioned. The institution was equally threatened by anyone who was simply too clever to be kept on a leash. Number 6. Dudley Moore. Dudley Moore did not get caught in a tabloid scandal. He did not insult an executive on live television. His conflict with the BBC was about ownership, and it ended with the deliberate institutional destruction of his own legacy. By the late 1960s, Moore and Peter Cook were the brightest stars on British television. Their sketch show not only, but also was a massive cultural phenomenon. When Moore discovered that the BBC was erasing the master tapes to reuse the raw videotape, he was horrified. He and Cook formally offered to buy the tapes outright, or at minimum to pay for new blank stock so their work could be preserved. The BBC refused. They wiped the tapes anyway. The official justification has always been that it was standard bureaucratic procedure. Tape was expensive. Archiving was not a priority. But when the creators literally offer to cover the cost, that justification collapses entirely. The refusal to let Moore save his own work was a cold, definitive assertion of institutional dominance. The network was enforcing a hierarchy. You do not own your art. You are an employee, and your life's work is company property to be disposed of at our convenience. Moore left for Hollywood and became a global movie star, demonstrating he was entirely capable of outgrowing the British television establishment. But the BBC made certain that within their walls he would not be allowed to leave a permanent footprint. Number 7. Peter Cook. For most entertainers of his generation, a BBC contract was the ultimate validation. For Peter Cook, it was a temporary convenience. He was arguably the sharpest satirical mind Britain has ever produced. He also possessed a trait that television networks find genuinely terrifying. He did not care about their prestige. When the BBC wiped the master tapes of not only, but also, Dudley Moore was devastated. Cook responded with cold, undisguised contempt. He had offered to pay for the physical tape himself. When the executives refused, it confirmed everything he already believed about the institution. They were not custodians of British culture. They were middle managers enforcing a filing system. Following that destruction, Cook effectively withdrew his best creative self from the mainstream television apparatus. He poured his energy into channels the BBC could not regulate, funding Private Eye magazine, establishing his own satirical nightclub, and eventually recording the deliberately unbroadcastable Derek and Clive albums with Moore. The BBC's control over British entertainment relied on a simple, unspoken transaction. We give you fame, and in return, you give us reverence. If we threaten to take the fame away, you apologize. Cook short-circuited that entire power dynamic. He proved that a truly independent mind did not need their cameras and openly mocked the executives who controlled them. The institution did not exactly banish Peter Cook. They maintained a system so rigid and defensive that the defining comedic genius of his era chose to operate entirely outside their jurisdiction. Number 8. Simon D. In 1967. Simon D. was not just a broadcaster, he was a national phenomenon. D-Time drew 20 million viewers a week. He drove an E-Type Jaguar, socialized with rock stars, and embodied the glamour of swinging London more completely than anyone else on television. Because of that staggering success, D genuinely believed he was untouchable. The BBC viewed his fame through a completely different lens. To the executives in charge, D was an employee, a highly lucrative one, but ultimately a modular component in their broadcasting machine. The friction was not about censorship or ideology. It was a pure, unambiguous power struggle over who was actually in charge. D began treating his ratings as leverage. He demanded enormous salary increases, threw tantrums over studio arrangements, and operated less like a hired presenter and more like a rival executive. He believed the network simply could not function without him. He severely misread the institution. The BBC operates on one foundational rule: no single personality is ever larger than the network itself. When his demands became unmanageable, they simply declined to renew his contract. D's fall from national superstar to complete obscurity is often framed as a personal tragedy. It is better understood as a demonstration of institutional power. By cutting him loose at the absolute peak of his fame, the BBC sent a message to every other star on their payroll. A television personality's power is a temporary loan from the network. The moment you forget your place in the hierarchy, that loan is instantly revoked. Number 9. Max Miller. In 1941, one unscripted joke was enough to get Max Miller banned from BBC Radio for 5 years. At the time, he was one of the most popular comedians in Britain. His act was loud, fast, and built on innuendo that landed instantly with live audiences. From the BBC's perspective, the decision wasn't about the specific content of the joke. It was about what the joke represented: a performer going entirely off script before a national audience with no institutional filter. From Miller's perspective, that was precisely the job. 5 years off the air for something that happened in a matter of seconds. And it raises a specific question worth sitting with. Was he removed because he crossed a line, or because he proved in real time that the line didn't actually matter to the audience he was speaking to? Number 10. Billy Fury. When Billy Fury arrived at the BBC in the late 1950s, he brought a physical vocabulary the institution simply did not know how to process. He was arguably the first authentic, visceral rock and roll star Britain produced. The network knew they needed to capture the rapidly expanding youth market, but they desperately wanted to sanitize it before broadcasting it to the nation. Fury did not perform polite, cheerful pop songs. He dropped to his knees, dragged the microphone stand across the floor, and projected a raw, unguarded sexuality. To the conservative executives watching his early television appearances, he was not an entertainer. He was an active broadcast hazard. The BBC's response was an extraordinary display of institutional micromanagement. Directors attempted to choreograph his rebellion out of existence, ordering him to keep his hips still, instructing cameramen to frame him strictly from the chest up. When it became clear that his natural stage presence could not be domesticated, the network quietly restricted his access. They sidelined one of the most electrifying performers of his generation in favor of safer, more compliant pop artists who were willing to smile and stand on their designated tape marks. The marginalization of Billy Fury was not about protecting family audiences from a bad influence. It was about a rigid establishment realizing it could not fully control a massive cultural shift. The BBC wanted to extract the commercial value of rock and roll. The moment a performer refused to let them neuter his art, he was pushed to the margins. Number 11. Adam Faith. Adam Faith did not look like a threat to the establishment. Unlike the leather-clad rockers of his era, he was famously polite, immaculately styled, and exceptionally articulate. Yet in 1960, the BBC abruptly banned his single "Made You," citing lyrics deemed too suggestive for their airwaves. On the surface, a standard case of mid-century censorship. The deeper friction between Faith and the broadcasting system was actually about intelligence, not decency. During that era, the BBC viewed pop singers as disposable commodities. They were expected to hit their tape marks, sing their hits, and gratefully fade into obscurity when their brief window of fame closed. Faith refused to perform as the compliant idiot. When he was booked on the rigorous highbrow interview program Face to Face, the establishment's implicit expectation was that he would be exposed as another shallow, easily manipulated youth. Instead, he calmly dismantled the interviewer's condescension. He spoke precisely about economics, psychology, and the calculated mechanics of his own stardom. He demonstrated that he understood the broadcasting machinery just as well as the executives running it. The BBC's eagerness to ban his music and restrict his influence stemmed from a specific institutional anxiety. They were entirely comfortable manufacturing teen idols. They were deeply unsettled by one who could not be patronized. Faith was marginalized not for being a delinquent, but for demonstrating that a working-class entertainer no longer needed the BBC to tell him how to think. Number 12. George Formby. At the height of his career in the 1930s, George Formby was the highest-paid entertainer in Britain. He was deeply beloved by the public and explicitly favored by the royal family. Yet the BBC treated this cheerful man with a ukulele as a serious threat to national morality. His offense was innuendo. Formby was the master of the cheeky double-meaning music hall song. When he released When I'm Cleaning Windows, a lighthearted track about seeing amusing things through bedroom glass, the BBC immediately banned it, officially condemning the lyrics as smutty and unsuitable for family listening. But the tension between Formby and the broadcasting establishment had very little to do with actual obscenity. It was about class. The BBC, under its early management, viewed itself as a paternalistic tool designed to educate and elevate the masses. Formby represented everything they were attempting to scrub out of the national culture, unrefined, working-class humor that relied on a wink and a nod rather than high-minded intellect. The ban backfired comprehensively. The public already loved the song and found the BBC's reaction absurd. But the institution's response to Formby established a revealing pattern. The network was perfectly willing to alienate millions of listeners rather than broadcast a cultural sensibility it could not tame. They did not restrict George Formby because he was corrupting the nation. They restricted him because his unstoppable popularity proved that the British public did not actually want the network's moral instruction. Number 13. Percy Thrower, of all the people to fall foul of the British broadcasting establishment, Percy Thrower is arguably the most jarring name on this list. He was not a provocateur, a demanding diva, or a satirical genius threatening the institutional order. He was the nation's head gardener. For years, his gentle, muddy-kneed appearances on Blue Peter made him the absolute definition of wholesome British television. His offense was entirely mundane. In 1976, Thrower agreed to appear in a television commercial for a brand of garden fertilizer. The BBC dropped him immediately. The network cited a long-standing policy prohibiting their personalities from using their broadcasting fame to endorse commercial products. And to be fair, the concern was legitimate. As a publicly funded broadcaster relying on a foundation of impartiality, having trusted BBC faces explicitly sell products to children would genuinely erode the institution's credibility. But it is the sheer ruthlessness of the dismissal that reveals the system's true nature. Thrower was not given a reprimand. He was not allowed to gracefully withdraw. The axe simply fell. His firing is essential to understanding the BBC's institutional psychology. It proves that their enforcement of control was not reserved for troublemakers and renegades. They did not only punish those who embarrassed them. They enforced a cold, bureaucratic hygiene across the board. Thrower's banishment sent a quiet, terrifying message across the entire network. No amount of public affection could protect you. To the institution, you were only ever as valuable as your absolute compliance. Number 14. Malcolm Muggeridge. In 1957, a prominent British broadcaster published a magazine article gently suggesting that the royal family was behaving too much like a celebrity soap opera. Within days, the BBC removed him from television entirely. The writer was Malcolm Muggeridge. He was not a delinquent or a tabloid liability. He was a former intelligence officer, a respected intellectual, and a highly regarded television host. His article did not call for the abolition of the monarchy. It simply observed that the institution was becoming a glossy celebrity obsession. But in 1950s Britain, the royal establishment was absolutely untouchable. When the Sunday newspapers manufactured a wave of public outrage over his mild critique, the BBC panicked. Specifically, they were terrified of losing their exclusive, prestigious access to the palace. They severed all ties with Muggeridge immediately. This was not a moral stand. It was an act of pure, political self-preservation. The network had happily broadcast Muggeridge's sharp, cynical intellect for years when he aimed it at regular politicians or foreign governments. They proudly promoted his analytical mind when it served their programming. But the moment he turned that exact same critical eye toward the absolute center of British power, the illusion of his journalistic freedom evaporated completely. Muggeridge was not exiled for telling a lie. He was exiled for exposing an uncomfortable truth about where the BBC's actual editorial independence ended. Number 15. Gilbert Harding. Long before modern reality television discovered the commercial value of unscripted conflict, the BBC had Gilbert Harding. In the early 1950s, Harding became the most famous man in Britain simply by being visibly miserable on a panel program called What's My Line? He was frequently irritable, occasionally visibly intoxicated on live television, and openly contemptuous of the contestants. By the BBC's official standards of polite, measured broadcasting, he was a walking institutional catastrophe. He was formally reprimanded forced to issue public apologies, and temporarily suspended from the airwaves on multiple occasions. Yet the institution always brought him back. If the BBC was truly as uncompromising as its reputation suggested, Harding should have been permanently removed after his first drunken broadcast. Instead, they kept reinstating him. And that requires an explanation. The answer lies in the precise nature of his misbehavior. When figures like Peter Cook or Kenny Everett rebelled, they mocked the BBC's authority. When Simon D. threw his tantrums, he threatened the corporate hierarchy. But Harding's instability was entirely self-contained. His rage was directed at panel show contestants, not at the institution. He did not challenge the system. He just yelled at people inside it. The executives understood that Harding's unpredictability was not a liability. It was a ratings asset. They managed him surgically, suspending him just enough to maintain the public performance of strict broadcasting standards, then returning him to the studio lights to drive audience numbers. Gilbert Harding's career is the perfect closing argument for understanding how the mid-century BBC actually operated. The institution never demanded moral perfection from its stars. It only demanded usefulness. As long as your personal unraveling was profitable, and as long as it did not threaten the network itself, the system would happily broadcast it to the nation every week. 15 cases, 15 different mechanisms: blacklisting, tape destruction, budget strangulation, moral clause enforcement, royal access preservation, and in at least one instance, the calculated, profitable management of a man's very public breakdown. What connects all 15 is the same institutional logic operating consistently across 5 decades. The BBC's primary concern was never the moral character of its performers or the artistic integrity of its output. It was control. Specifically, the preservation of the network's authority over every creative voice that passed through its doors. The performers who understood that and accepted it survived. The ones who didn't, or the ones who were simply too original, too independent, or too threatening to be comfortably contained, discovered exactly what the institution was capable of, regardless of how much the public loved them. If you've been watching and haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We cover British entertainment history with documented facts and full context. No mythology, no filler. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one.